And Romy.
Hi, Lori. I would introduce you now, okay?
Sure.
Lori Lefkovitz holds the Ruderman Chair in the Jewish Studies at Northeastern University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and is a professor of English. She specialized in narrative, and her books include In Scripture, First Stories of Jewish Sexual Identities and Shaping Losses, and Cultural Memory of the Holocaust, co-edited with Julia Epstein. Lori's awards include a Fulbright Senior Professorship at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Psychological Institute in Philadelphia. Herself, the daughter of Holocaust survivors, she is interested in second and third generation Holocaust memoirs and fiction, and in psychedelic approaches to trauma. So now you know why she's here. My name is Romy Neumark. I'm a veteran journalist for Kan, the Israeli public broadcaster, who co-produced and aired this film a year ago. And I'm a current Hebrew instructor at Harvard. I specialize in documentary and Israeli media. So I will try to ask you, Lori, now some questions I had while watching the film, and you can prepare for your questions too. And we're looking forward to hear them. So first, can I talk here? I need to do that. Okay. My initial thought was about trauma and survivor writing from a position of this split self we saw in the film, what Asaf Lapid, the director, did so beautifully here. But first, if I may, as a daughter to a Holocaust survivor, and I guess there are some also here in the audience, how is your personal background influence viewing this film?
Thank you for that question. Thank you all for being here. It's a privilege to be in conversation with Romy Neumark, whom I so admire, and to be in conversation with all of you after this powerful film. And it's interesting to me that you begin, of course, you know, I study narrative, I'm interested in psychoanalytic theory and trauma, but of course you begin right from the personal place of my own identity as the daughter of survivors and how I connected to the story from that perspective. And of course I did connect from that perspective because I think that there are, because I saw in the figure of Denur qualities and characteristics of my own parents, and in particular my father. And they say there are two kinds of Holocaust survivors. Those who speak about it very little and really try to protect their children or can't return to that place, and those who are more ancient mariners. That is, it is a story they tell and retell, always feeling like they couldn't quite communicate it. You know, they never succeeded, and my father was the latter. He was an ancient mariner. It was a story he needed to tell again and again. But the truth is, he would return to the subject all the time, which was a subject of losses and the subject of life before the trauma. The actual trauma was never fully communicated. I think that was simply not possible. The events of Auschwitz, the experience of Buchenwald, what that was like. So that's one piece. And the other is, you know, I think this one piece, several pieces. I feel I have as an adult had the experience of wondering who my father would have been had he become an adult in the languages of his childhood. The man I knew, the father I had, spoke English. The child who he was a person in different languages, where he was more literate and more eloquent, I imagine, or would have grown up to be more. So the idea that there were two people, the one who could have been, had life not been so dramatically disrupted, and the father I had, who was a person who had had a disrupted life and a previous experience I mean, I need to work harder to recover exactly the moments when I saw my own parents in the film, but I think, that particular piece of needing to, that the question that one lives with, why did I survive when my 3 siblings didn't? Why did I survive? And the answer for him was much the same as Elie Wiesel, and my father felt very grateful to Elie Wiesel. He felt that, here was somebody who was telling the story that needed to be told. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you lived in order to represent those who died, and that compulsion that we see in Dinur was one that I saw in not just my father, but other survivors who were in our lives, who were my cousins and other people, this compulsion to narrate the experience and a feeling of inadequacy that one couldn't. So that I think too, and it was a bequest. I mean, I feel like he was saying to his children, it's your job to carry this memory. It's your job not to let people forget. And I'll conclude by saying that, in the events in the moment we're living in right now, I have been sort of keenly alert to something that I hadn't noticed before in my own life, which is that if my parents felt that there was any consolation after the Holocaust for them, personal consolation, it was their children and the state of Israel. So what only occurred to me recently as we're living through our current traumas is that what that created for those of us who felt that same sense of responsibility was a kind of equivalency that between ourselves as children of survivors and the state of Israel as flawed sites of redemption, which creates an identification that's very complicated.
Thank you. The symbol of Ka-Tzetnik is something that I'm an Israeli learned about in the education system, which was, it's not like in the movie they said in the 60s they gave those booklets to the soldiers. I grew up in the 80s, and there was something about Ka-Tzetnik as we knew that he's the guy that collapsed in Eichmann trial, and besides that, this writing was for adults. It was like almost porn, and
it is a little bit pornographic if you
yes.
read like House of Dolls. It's smutty and vulgar.
But listening to you, I understand it's not just the life he could have lived or the life he left behind in Auschwitz and his new life in Tel Aviv. It's also how is it to be a symbol.
Yeah.
And there's something in this burden that I'm not sure that the psychedelic treatment, cured. And I wonder if you see how those psychedelics, LSD, is actually some kind of a treatment that actually helps post-traumatic. Because I think Asaf Lapid was very sensitive here. Like he didn't point it out, it worked for sure. He slept more, he had better dreams. That's it.
Yeah, I think you're very right to say that there's a burden that's carried, the burden of needing to narrate the story. The other sort of socio-political part of that a point the film makes at several moments, and that survivors will tell you often, I think, or at least in my experience, is that there was a burden to tell, and a burden that you felt was imposed upon you by the dead. The dead required you to tell this story. At the same time, there was an unwillingness on the part of the world to listen, to hear it. So it was a burden that couldn't be discharged. Mm-hmm. And my father said that, people it was almost a message of get over it. You're in America now, get over it. Why are you, and the idea that you never left the life that you left behind was something, when my father said the word home, he meant the Carpathian Mountains. And I remember saying to him once, actually, I said, Daddy, it's been 50 years. And he says, I'm there every night. So the idea of returning to this place in your dreams, that I think is, again, a piece of the burden that you don't leave it. But the refusal to listen made it impossible, psychoanalytically, impossible to recover. And my father actually said there was a moment, literally a moment, when that changed. And that was in June of 1967. Literally in June of 1967, 20 years after he got to America, Americans were willing to, they were less vulnerable themselves because of the 6-Day War, and were prepared to face the Jewish historical experience of trauma. But I think your question is more profound in another way. And it gets to, and now I'm going to approach it as a literary analyst, as an analyst of narrative. This is a film with a thesis. And it is a thesis that aligns precisely with Michael Pollan's book, if you haven't read it, How to Change Your Mind, which is really a polemic to make psychedelic treatment for Michael. It's more psilocybin, not LSD, as it had been in the 60s and 70s, to make this a plausible treatment for trauma victims. That there's something about the psychedelic experience that when you're properly guided through this plant therapy, and in Ka-Tzetnik's case it was, or in Dennour's case it was, he underwent five trips, 5 LSD experiences. The thesis of the film is that there's something integrative, that this trauma for Ka-Tzetnik was actually caused a psychotic break. It's practically articulated here as, borderline personality, or as we used to say, split personality, that he had two selves, and he became, and they didn't know each other. That when he was writing, he was Ka-Tzetnik, and his life as a parent, as a spouse, he was Dennour, and they didn't know each other. And the crisis happened at the Eichmann trial, when he entered into his Ka-Tzetnik identity, and the judges didn't let him stay there, forced him to exit it, and he collapsed because these two selves were not integrated. So the film, as a narrative, is propelling you to conclude that the treatments were effective, because what happens under psychedelics, at least according to Pollan, I haven't had the experience myself, though Pollan makes you want to do it, is the dissolution of the ego. So in this dissolution of the ego, you feel a kind of cosmic, in my conversation with Michael Pollan, I tried to get at the spirituality of psychoanalysis. I interviewed him, I had that, privilege, to ask what was spiritual, to get to the spirituality of it. And he says, it is a kind of cosmic perspective. Like you feel a dissolution between yourself and the trees and other people, boundaries fall, and that's integrative. So these doctors make the claim that it's particularly effective treatment for people who know that they're dying of cancer, for example, because it leads to a kind of acceptance of death, because you feel more oneness with the universe, that the burden of mortality is kind of lifted. So that, I think, is the argument that the film makes. And it makes it almost in the form of a punchline. So I share with you a kind of dis-ease about the conclusion of the film, about the unease. You say, he's not really cured, is he? And I don't think so either, but who knows, that's just a construct. I think the film is trying to make a case for the therapeutic value of the psychedelics as integrative, and that this cure is that he actually changes his mind about the burden of telling the story of the Holocaust. The burden used to be, we were victims, they were perpetrators on another planet to which you cannot go. I can help you approach what it's like with my writing, but we cannot go there because it's not the earth on which we live. And he even says, earlier when he's reflecting on the pre-psychedelic experience, that when I came back from Auschwitz, I couldn't believe the birds chirped, right? Like the world is unchanged. How could that be? So it was elsewhere, after the psychedelic experience, and this is a political conclusion. The political conclusion of this film, and I think that's why the young Israelis, this is made practically yesterday, are embracing this thesis, is that you don't have the choice really about whether you're the perpetrator or the victim. You're born into circumstances, and you could as easily be them. And that's what Denur discovers. And he says, from an ethical point of view, if you have a choice between being the perpetrator or the victim, I would choose to be the victim. I was better off than the perpetrator. And which reminds me of, Golda Meir famously said of the Arabs. I can't remember exactly the quote, maybe Romy, you do, but she, it's a famous line. She says, "We will hate them not for what they did to us, but for what they forced us to do to them." The idea that power is somehow what's ultimately corrupting in the human condition. And I think that's where the film it's dragging you to that conclusion.
It's definitely, I agree, it's dragging you to this conclusion, but I'm not sure that in the Israeli public there is acceptance to this kind of notion, even not today, of course not in real time when he published this book, and they mentioned it. It's something that almost was not published. And although he was trying, and he gave this first interview, and there were other things he was trying to do to get attention, he did not get this attention. And I read Asaf Lapid said in an interview when this movie just came out, that the notion that extreme evil is not just them, but could be us, was the reason, according to Lapid, that Denur's last book was almost forgotten. And the readers back then were not ready to discuss not trauma, not LSD, or not humanizing Nazis.
Exactly right, and the film ends with that. There's one of the spokespeople who says exactly that. We prefer the earlier message.
Second time for me watching this movie, I noticed something I didn't notice for the first time, that even covering the trial, and Israel was a state that was founded out of this trauma. And it's not just the judges that didn't understand how to work with a PTSD person who's giving his testimony. The journalists didn't know what to do with it. The way they framed it was not from a deep understanding of what he was trying to bring or what he can bring to this. And we're used to talk about the Eichmann trial as an important moment in how Israel is understanding or what is Israel actually in relationship to the Holocaust. And this is something that was never pointed out in the way that he's doing it. And there's a book that's published with this movie that is actually the first book of articles gathered together about Ka-Tzetnik in Hebrew. And an interview with Asaf Lapid is like the opening gate to scholars who gives different readings to Ka-Tzetnik. And I think it's an interesting way to look at our reality today, how we cover our traumas. As a journalist, I'm looking at how the Israeli media is covering the war, what's happening from the other side of the border. And there is something that I understand as living through the trauma of October 7th, again, in a way that leaves a lot of blind spots.
I think that's really very much the point of the film, that it's, who knows when we will be ready to hear the message that, this message of victim and perpetrator and how much is historically conditioned and historical circumstances. I think what you're saying is exactly right. And even in the moment, I don't remember if this is in the film or if I read it elsewhere. Of course, Hannah Arendt, who, to much controversy, coined after the Eichmann trial the phrase, the banality of evil, which is much the same message, said of Denur's testimony that it was an exemplary performance, that she did not actually, she didn't believe that he lost consciousness. She thought that it was part of his performing his victimhood of the Holocaust, which was not. I mean, he did faint. In the Israeli papers, it was reported as a stroke. Also, it was not. But this, again, how the journalists were trying to make sense of something. I mean, I was very struck with, how nobody gave him air to breathe, how it was the security guards and not a doctor who came to attend. How you see how dated the response was.
But also it became a symbol that people don't know that he actually spoke for 6 or 7 minutes before he collapsed. Like he did succeed to say several things beforehand.
Yeah, we heard some of that here.
And I will just say one more thing, and please just stand up and introduce yourself and ask a question right after it, whoever is interested. Lori is full of knowledge, and the fiction part, like what is real and what is not. Asaf Lapid is an editor, a documentary editor. This is his first film as director. We see how he plays. He has an actor who's playing Ka-Tzetnik. The recordings that we hear are this actor reading from the book. There are no recordings, actually. He didn't find any. And I read this interview. He really went through his archive. There's a lot of things in Dinur life that you don't find any, you cannot prove it. And I think he's playing really beautifully, artistically, with those claims. Like, maybe it happened, maybe not, we can still feel it. Without hiding, he's not pretending that everything actually happened.
I think there is some pretending, actually,
Yeah.
Romy. I just wanted, I think your point, this question is actually quite a brilliant one about the relationship between fact, fiction, and truth. And the film makes the point that fiction can be more truthful than fact. And I think that, or somebody, one of the talking heads, the trusted talking heads, makes that point. This, there probably was not a brothel of Jewish women, though now Holocaust scholars are they're revisiting that history, because of course it was illegal for Aryans to have sex with Jews. So for a long time, Holocaust scholars believed that Jewish women were not raped by Nazis. And now, of course, we know better. But there is still a conviction that there probably was not a brothel of Jewish women to serve the SS, but it's not clear. In the House of Dolls, the book that got originally got Ka-Tzetnik the most attention, is about this brothel in which his twin sister, Daniela, is imprisoned as one of the prostitutes. He names his daughter Daniela, as if memorializing his sister. He, however, did not have a sister, and people did not know that. And similarly, Lapid uses technology to recreate Auschwitz in the film. But we as viewers don't know that, and we as viewers, and this is where I was sort of wanted to qualify what you're saying, only because you told us do we know that that's not Denur's voice. Do we know that it's an actor? So he himself is playing fast and loose with the biopic, the biography, in the same way that Ka-Tzetnik played fast and loose with the details, the vulgar details that he describes of the Holocaust experience, in particular of this brothel and his sister, and memorializing his sister in the name of his daughter, and she wasn't real. I mean, those boundaries are really, I think, go to the heart of, again, the fact, fiction, truth. And, my field is narrative, I do fiction. I think fiction has many truths to tell, but we leave ourselves vulnerable when we don't admit, I think, that there is such a thing as fact. I used to not think so, but more and more I think that, that we need to honor the facts.
Yes, oh, we have a lot of people. Okay, let's start here in the front.
Surely.
Hi, my name is Shulamit Reinhardt, and I, like Lori, my parents were Holocaust survivors. And one of the things that I have come to believe I just wrote a book called Hiding in Holland, which is about my father's experience. I'm now writing a book about my mother's experience. And it's interesting, my father and my mother had the same experience, except they didn't, because one was a man and one was a woman. But one of the things that I learned from doing all the research about that is we should be very careful not to generalize about Holocaust survivors. They come in many shapes and forms. They can have many different types of psychological reactions. There are people who committed suicide after they were liberated. There are people who made a profession out of the Holocaust. There are people who moved to Israel, had lots of children, and felt that they were doing what needed to be done. So I think this is an extreme case. This is a man, and so many people passed through Auschwitz. Not so many survived. He had his own psychology. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he is maybe a type. But there are many other types. And I just want to tell you one, and we have to respect the differences rather than assume that everyone who has come through the Holocaust is the same. I just want to tell you one thing that my father did that I thought was very interesting. He was in hiding for 3 years, never left the place, never went outside, etc., etc. You probably know that story, and it's not the Anne Frank story, which was a piece of cake compared to what other people had to do. But my father entertained himself all the time. He played symphonies in his head. He did all sorts of things in his head. And then he wrote essays. And his essay that meant the most to him is, can we make Germans different? In other words, not I want to kill Germans, I hate Germans, but the German people who perpetrated the Holocaust and forced other people to participate as well, they were the subject of their education, which was Nazified very, very early. And they were also the subject of what the Hitler regime did. So is it possible for those people to become good people? And that really intrigued him. Maybe it's the same story here a little bit. And I think that we should also examine the profound questions that Holocaust survivors are asking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a quick comment, because I think, Julie, of course, your opening point is really well taken. And again, this is what, if one learns anything at a psychoanalytic institute, it's this, is how formative one's early experiences are. So each of these survivors had different childhoods. They entered the experience of whatever their experience was, whatever their traumatic experience was, at different levels of preparedness, at different ages, different sexes, different classes, and different levels of psychological preparedness to be resilient. So, of course that's true.
Yes.
My name is Ken Grosiner, and I'd like to hear your opinion as to whether or not I really missed the main point of the film. I took it to be saying that at first this man thought that evil and Auschwitz was here, it was a different world, but then he realized, to oversimplify it, that victims can just as easily be victimizers. And to me that's something that most people came to understand many, many years ago, and it doesn't seem to be to me to be a very profound conclusion. To me, it's almost common sense, at least during my lifetime. Now, I understand his lifetime and his experiences were completely different than mine, but I just don't see that as being a deep philosophical conclusion, especially, you know, given the world we're all living in. So did I miss something, or was that really the conclusion?
I think the context of this story in building a nation, in the Israeli climate of what you can say and what you can't say in the 50s, maybe this can help crystallize the message of the movie. Those are things that were never said in Israel. Like you're not allowed to speak like that.
I don't think you missed the point of the movie. I think that is the point. I think it may seem like not a profound point. What's wonderful about the film is the nuance with which that revelation comes to the actual survivor, who for the whole course of his life, burdened with telling the tales of the dead in order to make their martyrdom worthy, ultimately realizes what to you seems self-evident, that any of us could be anything, that's the human, that what we share is a common humanity. And that to you doesn't feel like a profound point. You feel like we're all raised with that. I think however much we may know that, we don't live as if we know that. No matter where we are, I think we are.
I would just like to modify one thing.
Sure.
I don't believe that any of us could be anything. I believe, of course, in free will, and you know, I'd like to think that when it comes to me and many other people, that there's a line beyond which we wouldn't go, regardless of the circumstances. That's my own personal opinion.
I think that, right, I mean, I didn't mean to, again, oversimplify in a simplification or a thesis statement, but you know, it is about anybody could be anything given all the givens of a life, the multiple contexts in which we find ourselves, the places in which, all the conditions of our upbringing. This is a kind of basic psychological truth that you are, who you are is determined by nature, by nurture, by conditions, by contexts, by, good and evil are not fixed. You're not born totally good or totally evil. And then there's all the overlay. And I think, maybe we know that, and yet we live, I think, often as if we justify our hate of others because we're so afraid of what they would do to us because they're so bad, whoever the they is and whoever the we are, that there's a tendency always in crisis to name good and evil. And it's very hard for us in moments of deep conflict, and here I would defer to the Israeli to maybe speak about that, to find common ground with people who we think are only hateful.
I would say that in my class today we were talking and I mentioned that I think that in the last year using the word Nazis becomes so much popular. And in Israel, of course in the Israeli press or like in the public sphere, it has to be something huge to use the terms from the Holocaust or Nazis, and now we're using it like almost daily. So things are changing when all this, a lot of things are happening. But the education system, I would just say, to think about the Jews who are forming a state, to be somehow close, even in a sentence of literature, of Holocaust survivor that will say that he's a Nazi, it's like a huge taboo. Huge, and this is why they were not talking about it, and this is why this movie is important, I think.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can we take two
Yeah, you
back
can do
to
two.
back,
Sure.
and then let them both ask, and then we'll address them at once.
Okay.
So 1 and 2, I see 2 hands. Yeah.
Laura, I think it's very appropriate that you cited Coleridge, because at the key moment of the film, at the apotheosis, he realizes that he shot the albatross,
Right.
or that he could have. My question is, after he comes to this conclusion, is he relieved of the compulsion to continue being this perpetual wedding crasher and to tell his story?
Okay, should we take the other question too?
Is there? Oh, well, two questions then.
Okay, let's take.
Okay. Yes.
Michael Waldman, I think, the movie was done before October 7th.
Sure.
I think its message is very interesting, very current, because Israelis today are, of course, victims of what happened, but they also have a lot of power. And then the question is, who are you in this spectrum, and where you can be both? So I'm curious to hear what you think.
So Asaf Lapid was asked, so the movie was screened before October 7th for the first time, if I'm not mistaken, but it was screened or aired in Cannes, the public broadcaster, in the last Holocaust Memorial Day last May. So he was asked about it. Do you see equivalence with October 7th or the trauma and the camps? And he said, I don't do that. Please don't make me do that. The Holocaust, the camps, this system is not what we're talking about when we're talking about the trauma of October 7th. So he was very sensitive about it. The fact, I think, that the audience is like Lori, you said, are like this is the narrative, this is where it leads you. I think that, like Asaf, I would leave to the audience to decide. I hope it answered your question.
Yeah. And to the point about the Coleridge poem, I think that that for Coleridge, who is of course a pre-Freudian poet, the albatross does fall off at the end, and I think we are left to believe that he's told the tale enough. I mean, one definition of therapy that I like is that the therapeutic process, that is the talking therapies, that the therapeutic process is about telling the story of your past often enough and in as many different ways as you can until you find a version you can live with. And that is the 19th century poet is a precursor to this Freudian idea of talk therapy, that you tell and tell and tell until you've told it and the burden falls. So for me, it's a sort of tragic story with a comic conclusion in the and that's but whether we are making machines, and I think we do want to find ways to tell stories that make them meaningful, that give them a point, that make us feel like there is at least the possibility of living either a healthy life or an ethical life, that we can raise children who are healthy and ethical. I mean, this is the will, and narrative is wonderful because it has a beginning, middle, and end, and leaves you with the illusion that there can be a kind of complete, meaningful story. But of course, life doesn't really have a beginning, middle, and end, and we are constructors of the meaning. And so I think, even the therapeutic model, whether it's psychedelics dissolving the ego or talk therapy like the Ancient Mariner, is just another construct in our desperate effort to somehow make sense of things.
Professor Lori Lefkovitz, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be back with you. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, to the festival. Good night.